Hi folks, welcome to Quarter Skills Chess Center. Please like, share, and subscribe. Hi folks, welcome back. From the 44th Chess Olympiad 2022 from Chennai, India. This is a really interesting game. This is Sam Shankland as white, rated 27-20 from the USA. Playing Dominguez Jr., only rated 2107. This is the USA Angola match. It was round one. And this is, a player like rated 2107 will never get to play these elite grandmasters ever. So this is a huge treat for a lot of these smaller countries that have weaker players that get to play and participate in games with super jams and grandmasters. Maybe even pick up a scalp here and there. This is a really interesting game. I think Black, as he's outrated by 600 plus rating points. And anybody that knows chess, that's a ton. And I think he played really well, but I think what's more instructive is the end game here. So let's get to it. Sam Shankland is white. Dominguez Jr. from Angola as black. It's a really interesting game. It's a Queen's Indian. Now, Queen's Indian is something I'm trying to learn as black as a response to D4. I have no decent response to D4. I'm still working on it. My E4 response is always the Scandinavian with D5. That sometimes transposes into the French, unfortunately. But I like the exchange variation, and I also like the variation where in the Scandinavian, if white tries to save the pawn, it makes for a crazy game, but I digress. We'll just go through the opening quickly. This isn't really about opening theory. Pawn takes, knight. This is pretty much all standard stuff. Pawn takes, knight takes. Bishop B5, that was an interesting move. I had the computer on off screen. And it likes knight to D4, and so do I. That's a really good spot for that knight, being there's no pawns on each side. For the knight to go here, there's no pawns on each side to harass it. So that's a good spot. But Sam chose bishop B5. Knight takes, bishop takes, knight E4. These guys probably know this opening backwards and forwards. I know Sam does. He's a 21 rated player. I'm sure his opening knowledge isn't nearly as vast as Sam's, but he's doing okay for a 21 or 100 rated player. Rook back. Queen, bishop, pawn. He develops his rook. So does Sam. And they're just playing through. The end game is the really interesting part here of this whole game. And I'm surprised. I mean, I'm looking on the computer here, and it's a tiny advantage, less than one pawn for white. So this kid from Angola is doing really well, actually. Sam's probably wondering, oh, great. I'm on board 4 of a 4-man team. I get the lowest rated player in Angola of all places. Nothing wrong with Angola. Just not exactly known as a chess country. This guy's over 600 rating points lower than me. If I draw or lose, I'm going to get killed in rating points because you lose rating points if you lose, especially to a much lower rated player. So this kid's doing really well. So let's take a look here. Knight to D2, the computer likes. Knight to E1 is the second choice, and that was Sam's choice, knight to E1. He's probably going to go after the bishop. Rook A to C8 for black. Knight to D3, go after the bishop. Forcing the exchange of bishops, which I thought black would do, but he didn't. He hit the queen first. Bishop takes. Rook takes. And if you saw there, that wasn't a miscue at all on Sam's part because he is hitting the queen even though the queen's being hit here. Rook takes, and the queen moves to A3, pinning the rook. And as you see here, the queen is unprotected. There's the old saying, loose pieces drop off. And an unprotected piece is a loose piece. So it looks like Sam might win the exchange. But rook to c7 comes back to protect the queen and saves that. Queen take, rook takes. Now, Sam's getting down where the queens are off the board now. It's starting to get towards the end game here. And usually that's where grandmasters really shine. Their end game play is the best of anybody in the world, especially a super GM like Sam. So let's see what he has up his sleeve. Go right after the isolated pawn right away. That's the only isolated pawn black has. G6. Rook d4. He doubles up the rooks. Knight d3 is going to put the knight somewhere else, probably on c5 to hit the rook and the bishop. I think that'll be a pretty good trade for Sam, trading that knight off for that light squared bishop. f5. Now, f5 isn't normally that great or any f pawn move, but the fact of the matter is the queens are off the board and the kings aren't really being attacked. And I'm looking off screen of the computer, and I'll tell you, there's less than one pawn advantage for white. Now, what Sam did wasn't even on the top 3 moves on the computer. The computer likes knight to c5, which I like, or h4, or knight to e5. Either one. Sam decided to go a different route. He went b4. And I think what he's trying to do is, you'll see towards the end game here, he's trying to get his pawns on dark squares. Why? Because he has a light squared bishop. And so does white. So as these pawns come up in the end game, black's pawns are going to be on light squares and white's pawns are going to be on dark squares. That means white can attack the black pawns, and you're going to see that comes in very, very handy. It's very good endgame thinking. That's probably what Sam was thinking about before. King comes up. Computer like rook to c8 better. Now Sam goes h4. See, he knows he just wanted to make sure that black didn't go b4 to make... He wanted his pawns on dark squares forward and the board get more space. King to f6, as we all know, a king is a very important attacking piece and defending piece in the endgame, especially with the queens off. Knight to c5, hitting the rook and the bishop, forcing the trade of knights. Now, you don't want to take with a pawn, because that isolates your pawn. That means this pawn will be isolated. You don't want to do that. You play rook takes. Because if you played b takes, rook goes to c7, how are you going to defend that pawn? You can't. King to e5, king comes right up. He's got to do it. I mean, he's got to hold his position. He's down a little bit. It's about 3/4 of a pawn advantage for white. Now, this is a kid from Angola that's 600 points rated less than Sam Shankland, one of the top players in the world. His adrenaline's got to be pumping. It has to be. So Sam brings his king in as well. Rook just maneuvering around for a while. Rook d2. I think Sam's going to double up, and he does. Bishop b7. Probably should have went a8 instead. King d3, here comes the king. Rook b6, this kid is just moving pieces of the move, and he's hoping to get a draw. And I don't blame him. Rook c7. Rook over. This rook comes up. And now the advantage is a little bit more. Sam has made some headway. Now we see why that black won't take. Rook takes rook. Because if rook takes, that means white is hitting this bishop and this pawn, and the rook gets behind the position. And that's murder for black. Just moves the bishop. Bishop b7, excuse me, rook c8, hitting the bishop. Bishop b7, rook b8, rook e7. See, that's the thing. These rooks get in here eventually, and they can start raising havoc this way. You certainly don't want that. Bishop f3. Rook on d to d7. Sam goes g4. He wants to bust up the pawns. Rook c7. Black has no part of it, because if white takes, he'll probably play king takes, because the bishop's guarding the pawn to keep these two pawns from being disconnected. Rook to e8. Now that looks like, oh, he's throwing a rook away. Well, not really, because if rook takes, and these two are hit simultaneously, so he can't take, even though it looks free. King to d6. Rook to d8, check. Finally, he blocks. So Sam says, okay, I'll trade this way. And that's how the rooks come off. Now, this is a very, very, very interesting position. Here you are as white. Believe it or not, off screen on the computer, it is now almost a 3-point advantage for white. Why do you say? Well, stop the video and look at it, or you can just follow along. Sam goes g5, and what he does. Now, these two pawns are stuck on light squares. This pawn can't move, because you can take en passant or just take. And how is the bishop going to stop the queening pawn? And remember that. King to d6, he brings the king up. Sam just brings the king up too. Now what happens is that bishop is now stuck defending this pawn. There's nothing black can do. And that's the problem with isolated pawns. You have to use your pieces that are left, your major pieces, to defend it. And this is the beginning of the end. It is now a 4-point advantage. Stop the video if you want to figure out why. Bishop a8, he just moves to move. Nothing else he can do. He can't move any of his pawns. h5. Excellent. Excellent, excellent. Now what happens if black takes? Black takes. Bishop takes. And white is screwed. White is screwed. Excuse me, black is screwed. So he just moves the bishop. h6. Key move. Key move. For a lot of reasons. One, it brings your pawn closer to the queening square. And this is the queening square. It brings it closer and closer and closer. This bishop is stuck defending this pawn. How is it going to get here to here to here? How is it going to get to guard the square? It can't. It can't guard the queening square. It's blocked out by its own pieces. King e6. He tries to bring the king closer. He just moves bishop g2. Got all the time in the world. King d6. f4. Sam's just playing with him now, to be honest with you. Bishop c6. Now, f goes here. Now, why did black resign? This is where black resigned. Why did he resign? Well, let's go through it. What can he do? What can he do? King's going to come up. That's a good way to do it. The king's going to get in, so we can't do that. So we'll just say we make a bishop move. Can't move the bishop away from guarding the pawn, so you've got to move him back. Okay. Now find the winning move for white. Stop the video here. What is the winning move for white? Remember what we said. These pawns are getting closer and closer to queening. And all of black pawns are on light squares. What is the winning move here for white? Give you a few seconds. Bishop h5 is the winning move. All right, let's just say black ignores it. Bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop, pawn. Pawn's going to queen. Now let's go back. Bishop h5. Say we take the bishop. Pawn here. If black ignores it, you go to queen, or take here and queen. If black takes, pawn goes here. And it's over. White is going to queen. Really, really instructive endgame by Sam Shankland. Really well done with the same color bishop ending. Notoriously tough. Bishop of opposite colors are normal, not always, but often draws. But when you have a bishop with the same color in the endgame, you want to put your opponent's pieces on the square of the color bishop. That way you can attack them. And it worked out beautifully for Sam. So my understanding is it was 3.5 out of 4 for the United States. I'm not going to go over the game, but Levin Aronian was actually maybe in a losing position, a very bad position against the kid from Angola. And he asked the kid for a draw, and the kid accepted. I don't know if I would have. Maybe the kid figured this is Levin Aronian, one of the top players in the world for the last decade plus. Probably strong enough to play in the World Championship. And he offered me a draw. I'll take it in case I screw up. His confidence was a little low because he's totally outrated and outclassed. So there it is, folks. Great, great endgame instruction from Sam. Remember this, the same color square bishops. But in this case, the weakness was the isolated pawn for black, which forced the black king and the white squared bishop to protect it and babysit it. There's going to be some great games coming up. I've only done the games for the U.S. so far, but there's some great games. Anybody get a chance to go online? Chess 24, FIDE Chess, a whole bunch of chess channels are covering the Olympiad. It starts about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning Eastern Standard Time, which is a little early for me. But you can watch it, you know, if you don't know what the results are, it's the same thing as watching it live. So until the next game, folks, goodbye and good luck.